Next one is Lyell's theory of uniformitarianism. Sir Charles Lyell, 1st Baronet, was a Scottish geologist who demonstrated the power of known natural causes in explaining the Earth's history. He is best known as the author of Principle of Geology, 1830 to 1833. In it, he advanced the idea that the Earth gradually changed over time. Importantly, he argued that geological processes that changed the Earth were all occurring now. Given sufficient time, the Earth can change a lot. This idea is called uniformitarianism. The principle of uniformitarianism is essential to understanding Earth's history. However, prior to 1830, uniformitarianism was not the prevailing theory. Until that time, scientists subscribed to the idea of catastrophism. Catastrophism suggested the features seen on the surface of Earth, such as mountains, were formed by large abrupt changes or catastrophes. When discussing past climates, opponents to uniformitarianism may speak of no analog changes. This idea suggests that certain communities or conditions that existed in the past may not be found on Earth today. The idea of catastrophism was eventually challenged based on observation and study of two men, James Hutton and Charles Lyell. Hutton was a Scottish farmer and naturalist. In his observations of the world around him, he became convinced natural processes, such as mountain building and erosion, occurred slowly over time through geologic forces that have been at work since Earth first formed. He eventually turned his observations and ideas into what became known as the principle of uniformitarianism. Among the scientists who agreed with Hutton was Charles Lyell. In 1830, he published a book, Principles of Geology, that challenged the idea of catastrophism, which was still the dominant theory despite Hutton's work. Lyell believed Hutton was correct about the gradually changing processes shaping Earth's surface. He found his own examples of these processes in his examination of rocks and sediments. For example, he discovered evidence that sea levels have risen and fallen in the past, that volcanoes may exist atop older rocks, and that valleys form slowly by the erosional power of water. The combined efforts of Lyell and Hutton became a foundation of the modern geology. Charles Darwin, the founder of evolutionary biology, looked at the uniformitarianism as support for his theory of how new species emerge. The evolution of life, he realized, required a vast amount of time, and the science of geology now showed Earth was extremely old. If there had been plenty of time for mountains to rise up and erode away, then there had also been enough time for millions of species to emerge and either evolve into new species or go extinct. Science conceptions of both geology and biology had entered a new day. Malthus on population essay. Thomas Malthus was an English economist. In 1798, he published the Principle of Population, where he argued that human population grow faster than the resources they depend on. When populations become too large, famine and disease break out. In the end, this keeps populations in check by killing off the weakest members. Malthus' principle of population caused Darwin to rethink many issues while coming up with his theory of natural selection. Malthus's work made Darwin realize the importance of overpopulation and how it was necessary to have variability in different populations. Darwin also used Malthus's idea to use competition as well as the survival in numbers idea to come up with his full idea of natural selection. Survival of the fittest. The idea that certain people become powerful in society because they are innately better. Thomas Malthus's work helped inspire Darwin to refine natural selection by stating a reason for meaningful competition between members of the same species. One example of that is the paper moth. Before the Industrial Revolution in the mid 1700s, the paper moth was most commonly a pale whitish color with black spots. This coloring enabled them to hide from potential predators on trees with pale colored bark, such as birch tree. The rare dark-colored pepper moths were easily seen against the pale bark of trees and therefore more easily seen by predators. As the Industrial Revolution reached its peak, the air in industrial areas became full of soot. This stained trees and buildings black. As a result, the lighter moths became much easier to spot than the darker ones, making them vulnerable to being eaten by birds. The darker moths were now camouflaged against the soot-stained trees and therefore less likely to be eaten. Over time, these changes in environment led to the darker moths become more common and the pale moths rare. Last one is the artificial selection. Artificial selection is the identification by humans of desirable traits in plants and animals, and the steps taken to enhance and perpetuate those traits in future generations. Artificial selection works the same way as natural selection, except that with natural selection it is nature, not human interference, that makes these decisions. In laying out the evidence of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection in his 1859 book on the origin of species, he highlighted the physical traits and behaviors of several species of birds called finches. During a voyage in the 1830s, Darwin observed these birds on the Galapagos Islands, a group of islands in the Pacific Ocean west of South America. Sometimes summed up by the phrase survival of the fittest. Natural selection is based on the following principle. In nature, organisms produce more offspring than are able to survive and reproduce. Offspring with traits that make them more likely to survive, mature, and reproduce in environment they inhabit pass on their traits to the next generation. As this happens, generation after generation, natural selection acts as a kind of sieve or a remover of undesirable traits. Organisms therefore gradually become better suited for their environment. If the environment changes, natural selection will then push organisms to evolve in a different direction to adapt to their new circumstances. How does this relate to finches? On the Galapagos Islands, some finches appeared so different from another that Darwin did not notice at first that they are all finches. In fact, they were different species of finches with a variety of traits. Some finches, for instance, had long, narrow beaks, while others had short, thick beaks. Darwin concluded that the traits of the different population of finches had changed over time, and that these variations were related to different environments in the islands. Each type of beak has evolved for a specific task. Where there was a large supply of seeds on the ground, for instance, short-beaked finches became more common because these beaks were better at cracking open the seeds. Where cactus plants were more common, finches developed long, narrow beaks to extract pollen and nectar from cactus flowers. Darwin's finches constitute powerful evidence for natural selection, but Darwin was also inspired greatly by the evolution that he saw in the traits of pigeons, not due to natural selection but rather artificial selection. Breeding pigeons was a popular hobby in England in Darwin's time. By selecting which pigeons were allowed to mate, people had a profound effect on their appearance, such as the shape and size of their beaks and the color of their feathers. Dog breeding is another prime example of artificial selection. Although all dogs are descendants of the wolf, the use of artificial selection has allowed humans to drastically alter the appearance of dogs. For centuries, dogs have been bred for various desired characteristics, leading to the creation of the wide range of dogs, from the tiny Chihuahua to the massive Great Dane. Artificial selection has long been used in agriculture to produce animals and crops with desirable traits. The meats sold today are the result of the selective breeding of chickens, cattle, sheep, and pigs. Many fruits and vegetables have been improved or even created through artificial selections. For example, broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage were all derived from the wild mustard plant through selective breeding. Artificial selection appeals to humans since it is faster than natural selection and allows humans to mold organisms to their needs.